Hi, I'm Noam. We're going to be making cookies again. This time we're making some spice cookies. And once again, these are a pretty simple variation on that basic cookie recipe, but the results are quite different. For our spice cookies, you will need 1 egg, half a cup of butter. I've actually cheated and used a little bit more than that because I want these extra buttery. Quarter teaspoon each of baking soda and baking powder. About half a teaspoon of salt, adjust to taste. About a teaspoon of vanilla, maybe a little bit less, again, adjust to taste. About a tablespoon of molasses. 1 cup of brown sugar. Don't be fooled, that's 2 half cups, just 1 cup. A cup and a bit of flour. And an array of spices. I'm going to be using about a teaspoon each of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. You can adjust that. These cookies go really nicely with ginger. Allspice is good. And you can have more or less of any of the spices depending on what tastes you like. To begin with, I'm going to put this butter in the microwave for just under a minute. If you have lots of time and lots of patience, it's great to be able to leave butter out so it can soften and you can mix it in nicely. But if you're in a rush or lazy like me, just throw it in the microwave. Some bakers will frown on that, but I have never noticed it to have any adverse effects on how the cookies turn out. While the butter's in the microwave, I've got this egg here and I'm going to beat it. Stand mixer is great. If you don't have a mixer, you can do this just fine with a bowl and spoon. I'd say beat the egg in a separate bowl with a fork and then put it in and then mix in the butter. So that's our microwave melted butter. And I'm just gonna pour that right into the mostly beaten egg and mix them together. Now that the butter and egg are fairly well mixed together, I'm going to add just a splash of vanilla. Not very much at all. And now I'm going to put in my molasses. I'm going to just do this by eyeball. If you want to measure it out, about 1 to 2 tablespoons will do it. It's not going to add a huge amount of flavor. It gets you a little bit of a deeper, richer flavor, and it also adds to the chewiness and softness of the cookies. And now I'm adding in my quarter teaspoon of baking soda and my quarter teaspoon of baking powder and about a half teaspoon of salt, again just by eyeball. I'm going to mix in our sugar and give this mixture a little bit more substance and cohesion. And now I'm going to add in my spices. So I'm only going to put in a little bit of the cinnamon, couple shakes, because for this version of this recipe, I want it to have a little bit more kick. So I'm going to go a little heavier on the cloves and nutmeg, and that's going to mean just kind of shaking these for a bit. If you want to regulate your amounts more carefully, use some measuring spoons, but my way tends to be the fun, messy way. And for our last step, we're going to add in the flour. And I'm just going to throw this all in at once. It started off pretty slowly. Batter is looking pretty wet and fairly liquidy, so I'm actually going to add in a little bit more flour, another half cup or so, just to thicken it up. Okay, so that's my additional half cup of flour. There's a balance with these cookies. If you get more butter and less flour, they'll come out thinner and flatter, almost like crisps. And if you get more flour in and a little bit less butter, then they'll come out thicker and a little bit more cakey. And I'm trying to go for a balance in between those. So that's thickened up the batter a fair bit. It's still not dry or very solid, but it's got a thicker texture and consistency than it did before, and that'll help shape the cookie. So here I've covered a standard 16 by 9 baking tray with some parchment paper and formed the batter into lightly flattened spheres. I put a quarter in there just for size reference. I will not be baking it. It's a little bit bigger than a quarter. They're about a teaspoon. And that's going to make sort of nice, small, slightly dainty bite-sized cookies. You can always go a lot bigger. I've got my oven preheated to 350. Remove that quarter. And I'm going to put these near the top of the oven, about one rack down from the top. So not right up by the heating element so they don't get too crisped too quickly. 2 trays in there. The top tray will be done a little bit sooner than the bottom tray, and that means I can rotate them, and I'm going to set this tray up in preparation so I can just keep these in rotation. That's my first batch just out of the oven. I ding this one with the oven mitt a tiny bit. They take, at this size, they take between 5 and 10 minutes. These were about 7 minutes. And they come out looking a tiny bit underdone. If you poke them, you easily leave a mark, but I like them soft and chewy, so that's exactly how I want them. If you want them crispy, leave them in for another 2-3 minutes and they should crisp up nice. I'm going to transfer this whole parchment paper over to my cooling racks. There's my first batch cooling on the rack here. They're nice and soft, and just pull the parchment paper back to put it back on the tray and get it ready for the next round. This is my 4th and last tray from this batch. I've run out of batter, so this isn't even quite a full tray. It's just these 8. And in this case, I've seen my first batch came out a little bit thicker than I wanted. So these, I've used the same amount of dough, but I've flattened them out so they're a little bit more of a flatter, wider disc of a cookie. And I'm going to see how that turns out. So these are my completed cookies. This is our 3.5 batches, and they're not the most visually appealing. They don't look super fancy, and that's kind of the point. They're very simple, home-baked looking cookies. They're cookies for grown-ups, really, is what they are. They're not super sweet. They've got a bit of a savory kick from the spices, and they're simple and really delicious. If you want to do something fancier and a little bit more visually interesting, the same recipe with a little bit more flour is really good for making cookie cutter cookies if you roll them out with a baking pin. And hoping to get to those in another lesson further in the future. In the meantime, enjoy the spice cookies.